going again. And obviously, these events have the generous sponsorship of a few companies. So OVO, Schologic, CACI, Equal Experts, and Forge Rock. So yeah, putting the money for the pizzas and for the venue and for the beer. So thanks to our sponsors. And introducing Jim, who's actually taught at Bristech before. I don't know if any of you were at the Creativity as Constraint. No, sorry, other way around. Constraint as Creativity talk. Yeah, so Jim's second outing at Bristech. So over to you, Jim.
Thanks. Hi guys. My name's Jim Morrison. I have a couple of different kind of roles, I suppose. My day job is a digital agency over in Bath, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for a digital festival we run in Bath at the end of the talk as well. And by all means, come and grab a pizza or a slice of pizza and a beer with me later on if you've got any questions. So we all kind of know that humanity is being pretty heavily disrupted by the technology that we in the room kind of build, I guess. And we looked at Moore's law earlier on, which is a great model for describing to people who don't understand the rate of change in technology quite what is going on in the world. The rate of change is pretty alarming, I think, and I don't believe that the government and the institutions that we rely on really understand what's going on, and I don't really believe that they have the capacity to deal with the rate of change. And so what I wanted to talk about tonight was who is really equipped to deal with the rate of change in our society and in our economy, and even in our security. I've spent quite a lot of time as my kids are growing up asking myself this question: who is really to lead our voyage into the future? To be honest, I reckon the answer is us. I'm going to resist the temptation to get all Monty Python with this quote. But I believe that we, engineers, software engineers, developers, I believe that we hold the key to guiding and changing the course of humanity, and ultimately this is why. So before I get on to like the disruptive tech and all the stuff that we recognise, I want to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the foundations of our social ecology, and kind of look back at what's happened over the course of the 20th century, and whether what happened in the 20th century has made us stronger or weaker as a result of the changes that happened. So my generation, I don't know which generation everyone here fits into, but my generation, and I'd say probably my parents' generation, from what I know of them, we have been brought up to believe in our institutions. And I certainly was brought up to believe that our institutions have our best interests at heart. And I'd like a little bit to explore whether that is the case. Does the 20th century demonstrate that our institutions have our best interests at heart, or does it demonstrate that maybe they have some other interests, or maybe they're just benign fools, perhaps? So let's start with science and health. This is a pretty old quote, but I like it nonetheless. So I guess most of us in the room we're engineers, we're developers, we're mathematicians perhaps, but we are scientists of one sort or not. And we believe in things like empirical evidence, and we are probably all peer-reviewed on a regular basis every time we do a commit that we wish we hadn't. And we all build on a canon of work, right? We all use each other's stuff from Microsoft Hub or GitHub, whatever we call it now. And we believe that the rest of the scientific community, where they carry out research papers and they publish those papers, that there is truth behind it. But, I mean, it's interesting, I didn't know that about Hadoop. I knew that Google had seeded seeded the idea, obviously, for Hadoop, and sort of seeded the big data revolution. I didn't realise that they'd done it, 5 years, whatever it is, after the fact, just Just to use it as a Trojan horse, that's a brilliant fact thing to steal. If we just look at the sort of normal scientific community, in the US a couple of years ago, when the statistic is nicked from, as much as 70%, in fact 71% of funding for scientific research in the United States comes from private sector funding. And there are lots of studies that I can find that demonstrate that scientists are quite open, sort of coming forward and admitting that the way in which they run their scientific studies and even the results and the methodology of their scientific studies can and often are swayed by the people who are funding the study in the first place. So science is not necessarily truth, and medicine is not necessarily what we need. Medicine I would see as the hero. I'll talk a little bit about this kind of model of the hero a little bit later on, but remember that I said that and then remind me when I forget later on. In the 30s and 40s, which is a little bit before my time, 30s, 40s and 50s, the tobacco companies used to advertise cigarettes. And they used to, they were doing that still into the 80s and 90s, and, side of Formula 1 cars and so on. But they used to advertise cigarettes by sticking a picture of a doctor, like a genuine bona fide doctor, saying, smoke Camel, they're good for you. And that was backed up by scientific research. And by the time I came along, that sort of stuff had been kind of outlawed. But it still goes on. When I was a kid, I was taught that you shouldn't eat too much fat because it makes you fat. But it doesn't make you fat. Eating lots of sugar makes you fat. All of the stuff that I was educated to think was good and healthy for me, like having a bowl of cereal in the morning or a Mars a day, or drinking fruit juice, right? Fruit juice is good for you. It's not good for you. It's got more sugar. We were looking at this in the office the other day. There's more sugar in a bottle of smoothie than there is in the equivalent amount of Coca-Cola. So it's not good for you. It's heavily refined, and your body metabolizes it and turns it into fat. But that research is backed by an entire economy that produces grain and fruit and so on to produce these heavily modified and heavily refined foods. And the research is backed by our governments and our institutions who tell us that this stuff is good for us. Until time goes by, and like the tobacco industry, somebody finally says, maybe that's not so good for us. Maybe it's not so good that the red lights are always on in the city because cars have to stop every time they hit the red light. And it takes 10 years of lobbying to get them to turn all the lights green at night, because they're fighting against some actuary who's worked out the fuel duty that would be lost if all the traffic lights were green. Right, exactly. So the science and health, scientific and health community that we kind of know and love and trust is actually skewed very heavily by the people who fund it, and the people who fund it either have a macroeconomic reason for skewing the science the way they need it, or they have a particularly commercial reason for skewing the science the way they want it. And there's an enormous amount of lobbying that goes on to perpetuate this. What doesn't happen is the research into the stuff that doesn't make money, which is the research into better lifestyle and healthy living, because you can't bottle that and sell it. So let's look at another big institution, and anyone that was here, about 18 months ago, when I spoke here last, will know that I have a particular fascination with education. So I'll give you a little bit of background if it's interesting. So when I spoke last, we were toying with the idea of keeping child 2 back from school. He's a very late August baby. He was going to be the youngest in his class by some margin, and the expectation of the school was, well, he'd go and he'd get on. And they refused to help us kind of lobby the council for him to be held back, because they thought it would make them look like a bad school that couldn't cope with a summer-born child. Now, it turns out we're lucky. Just as we were going through this process, the regulatory infrastructure for holding back summer-born children was changing, and we were able to hold him back. So we sent him the following year when he was pretty much the eldest in the class. I hadn't read Outliers by that point, but maybe he gets a little bit of an outlier opportunity because he's the eldest in the class. He gets picked for sports or whatever. But generally, from the research we've done, we felt it was better for him to go to school later. But when he started, we didn't stop looking into the education system and what's best for our kids, as I'm sure we all do. And in fact, so this is 18 months later, we've taken them out of school. There's 3 children, one is not old enough, but the other 2, they don't go to school anymore. And my father and my siblings think that we're mad and we're going to live on a commune somewhere and disassociate from society and quit Facebook. Well, maybe do that. But there are 2 reasons, like 2 scientific reasons, and then also sort of scientific and social reasons. The first is, this is not my field, so forgive me if I get stuff wrong, but there is a part of your brain that forms between the left and right hand side called the corpus callosum. It's about 250 million fibres, and in girls it matures and sort of, it doesn't solidify, but it gets its sort of sheath around it and becomes far more effective at about the age of 7 or 8, and then in boys at about 8 or 9. So it happens later in boys. There's an educational difference in the genders, which we kind of ignore as a society. Now it's important, right? Because if I take the example of a maths problem, if you do a maths problem that you can't store in memory, right? So the memory thing is a distraction. But let's take 78 times 35, which I probably actually couldn't do, so I'm not going to try. But and you try and do that sum in your head. There are sort of expected to be about 7 hops, mostly oscillating between left and right hand side. In order for you to calculate, you need to see the glyphs, you need to assimilate the information, you need to work out the sum, you need to do the sum, you need to do some, like your brain apparently does unit testing and kind of checks that it's probably right, and then you need to be able to articulate the result and then speak it or write it or whatever it is you need to do. There are about 7 steps you need to take. But those steps happen between left and right hand side of the brain. So if you're trying to teach a kid to do maths and they don't have that part of their brain formed, well then they're physiologically incapable of doing it properly. The same is true of reading and writing. So the other example that we've looked into a lot is if you're reading to a child at age 5, right, when they go to school, they're thinking about what you're saying and they're world building in their mind and they enjoy it. Right? This is why you read to your kids at night. If the child is doing the reading, which they're learning to do at that age, they're physiologically incapable of reading and world building at the same time. So they can't get the enjoyment out of the book because they can't use their brain in the way that an adult would use their brain to do both of those things at the same time. So we're bullying our kids' brains into learning how to do things in other ways. And they form different pathways because your brain is very elastic, plastic, whatever the word is, and it can find ways of doing the thing it needs to do in order to pass the test, right? You can find ways to read. But you're not doing it in a way that if you were taught later in life, you would learn to do it. So I kind of see that we are, we're kind of bullying our kids into learning to read and write and do maths and so on in a way that is not helpful to them. The other thing that played on us was, I suppose what it boils down to is bonding. We're all mammals, I hope, and we all have an innate need to bond with something. It's part of being a mammal. In fact, it's part of being quite a lot of, there are bird species and so that have this bond, but all mammals have a bond, and it's usually a parental bond. And we have that bond in our society for a few years, and then we send them to school. And we send them to school, easily as young as sort of 2 or 3 to preschool, and then we send them to a full-time education at the age of 4 or 5. And they're separated from us for 6 hours a day. So rather than forming their bond with their parents, they're forming their bond with whoever else they can find, because they will form a bond, and they end up forming a bond with their peers. So we're building a society, generation after generation, of kids who are not brought up by adults, but they're brought up by their relationship with their peers. And their peers may be lovely peers, but they're not an adult. They don't have the emotional intelligence or experience or technical expertise or risk analysis or any of the rest of it to properly educate their other peers around them. So we've all heard, I think, either firsthand or stand-up comedians who do it justice, the story of the child who's picked up from school and, how was your day at school? What was your favourite thing? they grunt in the car on the way home. And when they get home, they go straight upstairs and chatting away, enjoying the relationship with their peers. And it's because their bond, is with their peers. Their bond is not with their parents. It's not that they're disassociated people. It's not that they can't communicate. It's just that they lose the ability to communicate with their parents because they form such a fundamental emotional bond with their friends. So, I guess we didn't really feel that education, certainly early years education, was for our kids. We didn't feel that it's it's appropriate for us. But I kind of fundamentally don't believe it's really good for the child in general. If you are a parent, the society will support you while you have a very young child, and then very quickly we'll support you to get it into full-time care. And as soon as it's old enough to go to school, we will support you with full-time education. But the goal for society is to get that adult back into work, whether it's the mother or the father. So I would say that the goal of particularly early years care is the economy and the economy of people working. It is not really in the best interest of the child because the science doesn't support that it's in the best interest of the child, nor frankly does the result set of our education system versus the Scandinavian system where they go to school at 8 and they end up with much better education. There's something definitely wrong with the way that we educate our children, and I would say it's that we start too early. For what it's worth, I mean, we've been going at this for 3 or 4 months, but the difference in the social well-being, the fatigue, the stress levels, do you know what, actually the desire to learn, do maths and learn about, so teaching my daughter, you may or may not laugh, but she asked me to explain this to her, I didn't foist it on her, but I was teaching my daughter the other day about distributed denial of service attacks and why somebody would want to put a virus on a computer, but if it's a camera and there are a million of them, then you could mount an attack and you could take down a betting site before the Grand National or whatever. And she's 7 years old, but she's kind of world building as I'm talking about it. 6 months ago she wouldn't have been interested in the least, maybe partly because of age, but partly because, but that's maths, Daddy. What you do for a living is maths. I'm not interested. I don't want to do. I'm not good at maths. Well, she's 7. She's not really meant to be good at maths. So that's two of our major institutions: health and the sort of scientific community that goes around it, and education. Are they really working for the benefit of the whole of society? So I'm not going to go through all of them. Don't worry, but I like my quotes, so I'll cover a few of them. I mean, we can think about the military and our defence infrastructure and the sort of security infrastructure in this country. Whatever you may think about going to war in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, and whatever you might think about the reasons for doing these things, or the benefits of doing these things, I don't know if anyone can put their hand up and say, I feel safer as a result of what's gone on in the last 20 years. Or, frankly, anyone in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Afghanistan feels any safer for what's gone on. So, why do we do it if it's not actually benefiting society? Or at least, why do we do it the way that we do it if it's not benefiting society? And then, media, politics, banking, and so on. There are lots of things I could say about the banking infrastructure in this country. Somebody said to me today, actually, it was entirely at random, that they had someone suggest to them that rather than doing the quantitative easing that we've done in this country and give the banks loads of money so that they'll go and lend to people, they could have just given the money to us so that we'd deposit in the banks. Now, the banks would still have got their deposits up, but they would have had less control. There would have been a more free market approach to getting that cash into the ecosystem. But we didn't, because we were too fearful of letting huge organisations that kind of just, legalise gambling, we're keeping them afloat, rather than actually keeping society as a whole afloat. The newspapers, we've all seen it, the role of a newspaper now is clickbait. It's not really to tell the news. Did you know that Daily Mail's share price took a massive dive after Facebook started penalising fake news because their traffic dropped so much? And this is one of our big newspapers, and they get caught in this sort of thing. Who does it serve? And then politics is all wrapped up in this, right? So, do we all believe in our politicians? Do we trust them? Do we actually even understand what they think and the way that, where they stand? Because everything we know about them is perpetrated by a media which is more interested in telling us a story than it is in telling us the right story or holding a kind of an adult debate. So where does this leave us, right? It's a continuum. It's a big and complex mess, and I certainly don't suggest that I know all the ins and outs of all of these institutions or all of these parts of our social norms. But we are going through an enormous and fundamental technological revolution, of which we are the centre. And it permeates everything, whether it's the economy or the environment, or the way in which we communicate, or the conduct of war. All of these things are being disrupted by technology. And it's even permeating what it means to be human, where we have, whether it's AR or VR, or whether we are doing limb replacement, whether we want to see Jeff Bezos doing his Sigourney Weaver impression and marching down the road in his augmented suit. If any of you have seen that, it's proper scary. I mean, he's scary to start with, but when he's 20 foot tall, that's not good. Most profound about these, at least most immediate of these changes, I would say, is the way that we work. So there are, by my calculation of some really boring government statistics, about 10 million people in this country who rely in some way on driving for a living. That's a lot of people. And we're about to see the precipitous increase in the use of AEVs, automatic or autonomous electric vehicles. So what happens to all the people who rely on driving for a living when their vehicle drives itself? Now, we can have an argument afterwards about whether or not technology is there and whether or not Uber crashing into a pedestrian because the guy was reading the newspaper and he didn't have his companion with him is going to drive these things to a stop. But the truth of it is, and from the people that I speak to, certainly, speaking to people in the insurance industry, for instance, and again, Bloomberg's done a lot of research into the disruption in the oil industry. The truth is it's not really technology that will bring about this massive change, it's the economy that will bring about the change. Because if your competitor has Tesla trucks, like Pepsi buying them by the thousands to do their distribution, if your competitor has Tesla trucks and they're not paying drivers, then you suddenly become uncompetitive. And if you're having to insure your drivers who have a habit of crashing, whereas your competitor is not insuring, the insurance came with the vehicle at the beginning and there's no running cost, then, which is the model that Direct Line are looking at, then you're in real trouble. You can't economically perform the function of your business because you're competing against people who don't have your costs. So it's the economy that will drive the change in transport. And it's not just transport. We as a business, in my day job, we over-egg this, but we steal contracts from PwC and KPMG and these huge organisations. I mean, we're a team of half a dozen people. But the reason we're able to do it is because we're able to make small teams really efficient, and that's kind of what we all in this room do. We make smaller groups of people more efficient, and that changes the economy and it changes the way these big organisations work. As far as banks are concerned, they have challenges now from people like Monzo, who are a tiny team, who've built a bank in, from my count, like 18 months to get their banking license. An entire tech stack from the ground up, an entirely different way of thinking about it. I'm trying to get them to speak at BDF. I was chatting to them the other day. She said, "Do you know what I was originally told when I joined? The guy who founded it, he just wanted a bank who treated him the way that he wanted to be treated by a bank. That's their why. And they've built all of the infrastructure they need to run a real bank with none of the overhead of an HSBC or a Barclays or whatever." So whatever job we're in, and actually even our job, but whatever job we're in, we are destined to be disrupted by automation, by robotics, by Boston Dynamics robots going on sale next year, also quite amazing. Amazon warehouses which are entirely automated, farm tractors which are automated. A friend of mine works for is the sales guy for a system that drives around the field and it puts exactly the right amount of chemical and exactly the right amount of seed in every square metre of the field, because it knows every square metre of the field, and it optimises the field entirely, and it's entirely automated. The guy is still in the cab, but he's sitting there reading the newspaper. Even paralegals, something you would say is a pretty skilled job. Law firms across the country are reducing their paralegal staff because big data and Elasticsearch and things like this have allowed them to mine data at a much faster rate than a paralegal will, and they don't have to pay, well, they pay, but I mean they don't have to pay nearly the same rate as they would for somebody to do the work, or a team of people to do the work. So what we're seeing, actually, if you look at the numbers, is pretty slow growth in our economy, and pretty big growth in the corporations who provide this technology. And they are growing like super fast, to the extent that I thought I'd do a slide with a graph on it instead of just quotes. So what I've done is looked at Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Apple, as being like four tech companies, and I've looked at their combined annual revenue, so all public data, so you can go and check this and tell me that I've not carried the norm. But at the moment, those four organisations, like on their own, not including any of the other organisations, just those four, their annual revenues are in excess of 20% of our GDP at the size that this country is now. So what I've done is, here is a graph. Here is us, and this is me modelling on rolling average, just because that's about as far as my statistics got at GCSE. On a rolling average, a model of our growth as a country over the next 15 years. Here is the combined revenue of Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple. So, according to this, like, ultimately scientific model, you've got 8 years before their combined revenue exceeds our GDP. This is, we're talking about trillions of pounds. Our GDP is 2 trillion, 2.7 trillion or something. But the rate at which they're growing is exponential, and the rate that we're growing is not exponential. It's 2 or 3% at best. So we've kind of got to consider, as a society, that we're staring at a future where corporations outweigh the size of our governments. I mean, these organisations already outweigh plenty of governments in the world, but we're looking at a future where they outweigh some of the major economies in the world. And they don't have a welfare state to support, they don't have a healthcare to support, they don't have any of the costs that the economy has. And the support that we get from our economy, from our government, comes from taxation and employment and all of these things, which are being decimated by these people who are making the money. So that's where we come in, according to John. So the truth is that we in the room, and quite a few other people like us, are actually creating this future. We are perpetuating this, we are building this future. And in running the digital festival, I've kind of discovered that there are an astonishing array of organisations doing some incredible, amazing stuff in a 20-mile radius around Bath and Bristol. Whether it's AI or machine learning, and I know a lot of you are kind of moving into that space. Anything from natural language processing, I can't say it, natural language processing, or spatial awareness and UAVs, and a guy who's making like a tiny little fly, like a pack of chewing gum. Robotics, AR, VR, and the applications spread into aerospace and transport and logistics and fintech and so on. Just as a collective in the Southwest, there's an enormous array of technology being developed. What we do as a business is, we do all sorts because we do what our clients want, but we do a lot of work in the aid sector, and I'm kind of on a mission to first reduce the amount of money that goes into the management of aid distribution and increase the amount, therefore, that goes out on aid, but also make the whole system lean, which is a difficult thing to encourage. Quite standard process to become more lean, but in order for aid to work effectively, the more lean it is, the more effective it is, because it's about learning in grant making and being able to repeat your successes and not repeat your mistakes. So, as a sector, I would say that we are the enabler. We enable the change, whatever the change is, and we have an opportunity to, or maybe even a fundamental opportunity and responsibility to decide on the direction that that change takes. We have an opportunity to define the moral compass of our organisations, to be the magnet that defines the moral compass of our organisations, because ultimately we're the ones building the tech that we're being asked to build. And if we're mindful of our conduct and mindful of what we do and the decisions we make and what we agree to do and what we don't agree to do, then we have an opportunity to push back on the stuff that we don't think should be done and create more things that we think will benefit us as a society. If we all can believe that technology is the thing that will define the future of our children, then as people building the technology, we are part of that definition. We have the role of defining that future by proxy. So when I speak to people about this, there's usually quite a lot of dissent. I hear these things pretty often. I'm one cog in the machine. I'm one person. I can't make a difference. People don't care. I hear that a lot. People don't care about their privacy. People don't care about GDPR. They just want their inbox to stop filling up. They don't really care about their privacy. They don't really understand what Facebook or Google do, and they get something for free, so they're not bothered. And these organisations are kind of Google and Facebook and Amazon. They're pretty enormous. We can't stop them. We can't change. Jeff Bezos is coming. He's in his big Sigourney Weaver suit. And we kind of accept it as normal, and normal is not easy to disrupt. We can't disrupt normal. It's too big. So it becomes really easy to assume that we can't change things. So a bit of a sidetrack, but I happen to live very close to a place called Eagle House, where Emily Pankhurst lived. Emily Pankhurst, for those of you who don't know, was a leader in the emancipation of women and women's rights movement. And in that instance, a very small group of people managed to change the normal. And the normal that had been the normal for a really, really long time. Society tends to accept normal until a small group of people come to change. Whether it's Emily Pankhurst or it's Dr. Martin Luther King, whoever it might be, it only actually takes somebody to catalyse a movement for things to start to change. And we can consider all, even in our lifetime, not quite in my lifetime, but depending on which country, well actually not even yet, depending on which country, legalisation of homosexuality, the abolition of slavery before it. These things are massive changes to what society considers normal, but they happen because ultimately a few people start to instigate a change. Now, I'm not comparing our role to yet, I should say, to the abolition of slavery or removal of some sort of overt oppression. But we are entering a time of massive social change. I don't believe that's disputable. And that social change is happening because people like us are enabling companies to conduct that change. We enable it by developing the stuff that we develop. And so we are either complicit in that change or we make a concerted effort to define what that change is. So I said about the hero earlier. I want to talk a little bit about a sort of thought tool that my wife uses. So my wife works in the business doing continuous personal development and works with all of the staff just on their well-being, basically. I think we as a society consider our well-being and our health, our mental health, as something that we need to think about when there's a crisis on the whole. It's like going to the gym once your doctor tells you you're obese or you have a heart attack. Our approach is to make sure that everyone in the organisation is listened to all the time, and that we work well as a team. And that's not really my skill set. Maybe I like having my headphones on, but it's her skill set. She's a trained therapist and CBT professional and mental health nurse and so on. So I've stolen this from her. There are two triangles, right? The first one is called the stress triangle, or the panic triangle, the drama triangle, if you like. And it looks like this. We have the victim and the hero and the villain. And these are three characters that we all carry around in our heads all of the time. The victim at the top here, he's driven by fear. It's not my fault. My ID crashed. There was a bug. The hero is righteous. He swoops in. He fixes stuff. He leaves without a trace. He leaves a vacuum behind. And I said to remind me, and he didn't. Our medical system is the hero, right? We provide the fix and then we run away. Here is the drug, here is the aspirin to fix your headache. But it doesn't provide, why did you have the headache in the first place? What was it that caused the stress? What was it that gave you the crick in your neck that made you wake up with a headache? That's not an interest of modern science or modern health. All we really care about is, here is the pill to take. And to the extent, this is a massive sidetrack and not my notes or anything, but I love this fact. The biggest kind of war on drugs, the biggest problem in the war on drugs in the United States is the proliferation of a drug called crystal meth, okay, methamphetamine. One of the biggest lobbying groups and industries in the US and Canada and kind of around the world is the pharmaceutical industry. And one of their biggest genres of product is antidepressants. And the biggest antidepressant in the United States, and I think in Canada too, is a drug called Adderall. Now, Adderall is like one nucleotide or base pair, or whatever it's called. Science is, right, chemistry is awful. But one bond basically different to methamphetamine. It is ostensibly the same chemical. It has exactly the same effect on your body. If you smoke Adderall, or if you ingest orally, you swallow methamphetamine, the roles are entirely reversed. So we have an entire industry predicated on selling what is ostensibly a legal drug, and an entire illegal industry selling what is exactly the same as a legal drug. There's no difference in the chemical. The difference is the way in which society approaches the people who manufacture that chemical. The chemical is basically the same. So that, the system is crazy. That was a distraction. Mind blowing. The villain here, so our last corner, bottom right hand corner, really is spelled that way, apparently. I did a lot of Googling. The villain is blame, right? It's somebody else's problem. So we've got the victim is driven by fear. It's not my fault, don't leave me alone. The hero is kind of righteous, I'm going to fix it, and then he vanishes. And the villain is all about blaming somebody else. But there's a counterpoint to this that we also all have in us, and it's about our approach. So when I stand up and I say really weird things like the developers shall inherit the earth and it's our role to change society and these sorts of things, you're probably thinking about what I'm saying with one of these three characters, and you'll be forgiven for doing so, and that's absolutely fine. But if we change the way that we consider, the way we think, if we're mindful about the way that we think about these things, then we have an opportunity to use the other three characters that we have access to. So they are the creator, the coach, and the challenger. And they're the same three characters, right? They're the counterparts. So where the victim is driven by fear, the creator is driven by the joy of the unknown. Okay, the creator is driven by failing and learning and developing the next big idea. So when you are approached by something and your natural reaction is to be fearful of it, to, oh no, I can't do that, I'm not good enough, it's not my job. If you're the creator, then the natural reaction is to say, oh yeah, I'll have a go at that. I might not know how to do it, but I'm going to have a go. But it's the same little bit of your psyche. The hero swoops in and fixes the problem, right? But the coach, same character, the coach comes in and says, how could you have done that differently? And I think the adage we like in the studio is, the hero gives you fish, and the coach teaches you how to fish. The coach says, this is how you go about doing it, and leaves you with the growth in knowledge. And then the last one, the villain. So the villain blames the challenger quizzes. It's the same method. The same kind of trait, but with a different method. How could you have done that differently? Why did this happen? We all have our 5 whys, right? Why did this happen? How can we do this better next time? But it's about building a blameless culture, or a blameless approach to people around you, rather than just passing on the blame. So if we can apply this different thinking and be mindful of the way that we approach problems, then we have the opportunity to affect real change. So the assumption that we're small and we're one-offs, we work in an organisation, we're one cog, we can't do anything about it, is, I would say, false. That's one of our three drama triangle psyches working. Saying it's not my fault, it's not my job to do it, I can't do it, I can't deal with it. The truth is that as a species, developers and software engineers are actually part of the biggest community of people who have figured out how to interconnect, how to communicate with each other, how to collaborate on projects across time zones, across the world, and like big, complicated projects and problems. We're really good at mounting a defense against a problem. We're really good at solving problems as a collaborative group. We're really good at co-creating. As long as we're interested in the problem at hand, right? Building Hadoop, for instance. It's what we do natively, it's what we do all the time. And with the challenges we've got ahead, there's kind of the Goliath organizations that are very difficult to deal with and change, with the disintegration of truth and the way in which the media is changing, with the manipulation of politics and the sort of scandals we've had out of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and whatever else Robert Mercer cooks up next. I think we're actually more capable as a group, as a species, than we probably give ourselves credit. And as I said before, I think it's our responsibility, because we are in demand by the people who are affecting this change, it's our responsibility to be the magnet that steers the moral compass of all of the organisations that we work for. So if you think you're too small and you're too much of a cog in the machine, that's the victim talking. You've got to consider what the creator would think. We have a channel that gives us access to millions of like-minded people, and we have the means to orchestrate a collaboration on a massive scale. If we think that commerce has gone too far and it's Amazon's fault, well, that's the villain talking, and we're just apportioning blame to these big organizations. But we also have the opportunity to mobilize the silent majority. We have the opportunity to change minds and to change mindsets and to change the ethical practices of the people around us. If we think that people don't care, and that's the one I hear the most, people don't care about their privacy, that's us just being the hero. We're just fixing the problem. We're going to deal with this for you. Unless we are the coach, unless we educate people about the importance of protecting their privacy, they're never going to care about it. But that's our responsibility, because at the moment we are disenabling them from caring by fixing the problem for them and not really explaining through why their privacy matters. So people will never learn to care while we continue to play the hero. As a breed, as I say, we're more connected than any other on the planet. And as a breed, we're closer to the driving seat, we're closer to the epicenter of this change that's going on in society than any other profession. We have the chance, I believe, or the responsibility, or even the duty, if you want to go that far, to combine our skill sets and to drive through a better change that benefits society, not just benefits the institutions or the economies of the organizations that we work for. None of the others, the banks, the boards, the governments, the shareholders, the politicians who serve all of those people, none of them are going to make this change. And I don't believe any of them have the capacity to make that change. Board members can't make this change. Politicians have no power to wield anymore to make this sort of change. I don't think they could do it if they tried. I think we hold the key as a group, and I think that we have the opportunity to steer humanity. In fact, I go further than that. I say we are already steering the course of humanity. This is not really about changing what we do. This is about being more mindful about the way that we do it. And given the rate of change, it's basically us or no one else. We have the choice between utopia or dystopia, but the choice is ours. So I would say with great power comes great opportunity. Oh, great responsibility, sorry. And I actually don't know who this quote is, because I ran out of time to look it up. But it's his uncle, right, that says this?
Right. Yeah.
Is that right? Does he have a name?
He's Ben.
Ben.
Uncle Ben.
Ben. I will update the slides if I just talk again. Cool, that's it. forgot, a shameless plug. I have flyers. Everyone, they're supposed to be in your seats, but I got distracted by beer earlier on. So. If you want a flyer for the digital festival this October, come and grab one. They're free. Any questions? Cool. Oh, yes, a big problem.
So, with all this change and disruption that the developers have the capability of delivering, and what, if you look back over recent history, what are the big successes that we've managed?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say we as a body don't currently make a concerted effort to enact any great change, because I don't think we believe it's our responsibility. So the things that we have managed are the canon of open source software is a good example, but that's not necessarily for the benefit of the society. So society, in fact, if anything, is for the benefit of, I could go back to that graph, right? That the altitude of that graph, the curve of that graph is in large part helped, accelerated, and so on by our collaborative efforts. So that's what I'm saying. Like, we are already part of this. We're already doing it. The notion that we're too small, we can't affect a change is nonsense. We are already affecting a change. What I suppose I'm saying is we're not mindful to the change, and so I would say science as a whole, and computer science and medical science and so on. There are lots of great advances we have made, but there are a huge amount of advances that we haven't made because we ignore things which are not commercially beneficial. And we as engineers, whether we're, I know a group in Somerset who deal with like digital genomics. It's insane the stuff they're doing, and they're doing it. Bless them, they're doing it for commercial ends. That's their business model. But we're not using that data science necessarily for. We use that data science for generating more drugs, but we're not using that science for looking at ways to prevent disease without using drugs. And actually, if you look at, I can send you some videos to look at, but if you look at the way in which we interact as a society, we drive ourselves into these incredibly stressful situations the entire time. And as we're driving the cortisol through our body, what we're doing is degrading our immune system. And then we're beefing it up by caffeine, obviously, but taking medication to protect ourselves from the diseases, the chronic diseases we give ourselves by living in this infused stress state. So the money is going into the hero solution, and our engineering is going into supporting those people who are making the hero solution. It's not going into the kind of the solution that doesn't need it's not going into the coaching. Hello.
Maybe more of a contribution than a question, but it just resonates a lot because I work in machine learning and AI and natural language processing. You mentioned all of that, and I think a lot of our contribution can be in just the education of what the capabilities of those technologies are, because I think we sometimes take for granted that the decision makers know what the capabilities are. But what I've observed quite a lot is that the decision makers extrapolate from their knowledge of existing technologies, which are process automation and those kind of things, that AI is going to be really good at replacing menial jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a tiny fraction of what AI can do, and it takes a bit of inspiration and communication of the capabilities to push people towards the decision support type systems that help you do your job better, and to tell the story of how that creates value and all of that, and to drive away from just pure cost saving measures. So a lot of what you said resonated quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean it's exactly right. I think AI is used to solve business need, and a lot of AI. I mean, a lot of it comes out of the gaming industry, right? But from the hardware to the methodologies and so on. But if you look at who's driving the development of these things now, it's the organisations who make money out of understanding our data. If you have I would argue, because I would, if you have Apple products, they make money out of selling you ludicrously expensive equipment, whereas Google and Amazon, they give you a free thing to have in your house, but they're learning from you all the time, and that's the motivation, and it's a manipulative motivation, and it's driving the science of the computing science forward, but there's no one putting money into using natural computing science to do things which are more meaningful for society, like studying the way we educate our children and whether or not we do it appropriately.
You said obviously it takes, in movements in the past, individuals or small groups of people to stand up and say, you said Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Emily Pankhurst. Are there any individuals that you come across or whatever that kind of are starting to do that in the digital development space?
Don't say Elon Musk.
Do you know what? That's what was crossing my mind, but there's a problem with that, I suppose. He's a very interesting character. Well, he's a very interesting character, anyway. He's very interesting in the way that he looks at the problem. Right? Here is a problem that's difficult to solve. How do I take the cost out of it? How do I make tunneling cheap? How do I make rockets cheap? How do I disrupt the financial industry? And what's this other one? How do I change transport? And you could look at him as a benign billionaire. He is changing the transport industry, which is good for the planet, but it's not necessarily good for society because society doesn't know how to cope with those things. So I think you're right. I don't think he really counts because I don't know if his motivations are correct. The short answer is I don't.
I just meant that's the obvious one to mention. So what's the more insight from you?
So the short answer is I don't. I don't have a technical Martin Luther King, unfortunately, yet.
Yeah, it was John Brawl.
Not me, but I don't know. You maybe say people like Chris Anderson, I suppose, who spread ideas, use their strapline, but that's a pretty altruistic thing to do. And I suppose there are a load of tech billionaires who've stopped being tech billionaires and started being philanthropists, I can't speak. And that level of grant making is sometimes useful, but it's not always useful because there is also always a commercial edge to it. Because we live in a commercial world. The opportunity, I guess, is that we live in less and less of a commercial world because the commerce doesn't sustain this. Like the way in which automation is going, it becomes unsustainable quite quickly, and we have to look at a different way of people climbing Maslow's triangle, right? A different way of people getting value out of their daily life, rather than going to work and earning money. And maybe that is the opportunity then to look at doing things which benefit society rather than benefit the corporation. Sorry, did you have another?
It just occurred to me that maybe looking for the Martin Luther Kings is a bit dispiriting because it seems like such an unattainable goal.
I totally agree. It's unrealistic, and he wasn't. I mean, he was Martin Luther King when he was born, but he wasn't Martin Luther King when he stood up. He was just a Baptist preacher, right? The kind of the sainthood happens decades later.
And I think these days, even organisations that still aim to make money but just don't push it all the way, that's already something that I think we need to appreciate and encourage. And I don't know. I think of the CEO of Unilever. Unilever is a massive corporation, so your initial reaction would be to say, "Oh my goodness, commercial, forget it." But they definitely push the kind of sustainability angle a lot, and that comes from him. That's definitely a personal drive. And in that case, it's somebody who's sitting right at the top of the organisation. But that level of trying to follow the right motivations happens at all levels. People who work on, prosthetics or lots of cool stuff. So it's probably something to look for.
I mean, I agree. I think Emily Pankhurst wasn't the only suffragette. And I think we picked these people long after the fact as being the celebrities because this is the way that media and this way society works. But they don't affect change on their own. They're not single-handedly making change happen. They're just a figurehead. But as the change is going on, they're just part of a continuum. And I think it's a kind of myth that we propagate. Goes back to outliers, I suppose, and kind of the role of celebrity. But it's a myth. Oh, sorry. I can stop.
I was going to say, I'm Spartacus. Anyone want pizza?
Great. Well, thanks to Jim and thanks to Dan. pizza is here. Do help yourself. Obviously, drain us dry as well. Next month, we have function as a service and also DevSecOps from Simon Minton. So do join us next month. I'll be putting that up tonight. So thanks a lot. Bye.